One is that I am very optimistic about the price of gold in 2024. And the reason is that the world is going to become increasingly chaotic. Maybe if a good president comes in, we have a, a breathing space for a couple of years. But apart from that, we're going to become very chaotic over the next few years. And even if a Republican president comes, I think America is now recognizing that it has no business getting involved in the affairs of other countries. So I think gold price has a good future, at least in 2024. The one thing that the world is not paying proper attention to is, or actually thinks that is very contrary to what I think, is China. China is a far better country than the Western media portrays it to be.
Jayant, how you doing?
Uh, I'm very well, Andy. Thanks for having me. Merry
Uh,
Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you. I was telling you, I had such a good talk and a good time talking with you last time that you were on. And really, we talked about just the world being chaotic and a lot of upheaval, if you would, and a lot of just things that we've haven't seen, and it's really happening worldwide. And I just really thought a lot about that during the interview and then after. And I wanted to get your opinion and really project that out into 2024. What do you see going? Do you see things become more stable or more unstable, if you would, in 2024?
Andy, a lot, in my view, really depends on what happens in the USA. Um, for the last 1 century or more, uh, the guardian of peace in the world, Pax Americana, has been the USA. Now, do you know how many coups have happened in Africa in the last couple of months?
I
Uh,
have no idea.
I, I don't think many people know about it, or that many people even care. From and depending on how you look at the news, anything between 5 or 6 countries have had coups in sub-Saharan Africa. Venezuela is threatening a war on Guyana, and you see a massive conflict in Sudan developing right now, which is actually leading to several times more deaths than what you hear about what's happening in Gaza. So the world is focused on issues that are relatively noise compared to what is actually happening globally, because we think that those issues, Sudan, Niger, Guyana, do not affect us. But the larger issues are much more chaotic than these isolated issues like Gaza and Ukraine. But what I see is Pax Americana coming to an end. Now, Andy, when I lived in India or when I go to India, the reason I feel safe going there is not because of liberty oriented people living in that country, and there aren't any liberty oriented people living in that country, or because of democracy in that country. I feel relatively safe because of the United States, because if anything goes wrong, the United States gets up, rises up, and challenges bad behavior of governments. So a lot depends on the USA, and a lot depends on what happens with the election outcome of the USA. Is it going to go more woke? Is it going to go more towards the Democratic Party? Or is it going to go towards the Republican Party? And moreover, if it does go to Republican Party, is it going to go to Nikki Haley, or is it going to the power is going to go to the other 3 or 4 gentlemen who are standing for elections? So I think a lot depends on it. That's what I'm focused on.
There's a couple things I want to get to this later because that certainly has an impact. You mentioned the coups in Africa and war with or potential war with Venezuela and Guyana. And those have huge impacts on natural resources. And so I do want to work that out a little bit later. But my question to you is what you just said is, I guess, do you see the US being more stable, a stable influence? And that was always the traditional view that I held, if you would punish evildoers, if you would. But it now seems like we're meddling in other people's business when we shouldn't. Um, and also this whole idea of like a military industrial complex. Talk about that and what's your view on all three of those?
Well, Andy, the United States is no saint. The US meddles in affairs of other countries. But tell me a country that does not meddle in affairs of other countries. Tell me a government anywhere in the world which is less evil than the United States government. Now, I have absolutely no respect for bureaucrats sitting in Washington or even politicians sitting in Washington. But then I have a lot less respect for uh, people sitting in Ukraine's government or people sitting in the government of most of the third world or actually most of Europe as well. So the it's in life, everything is relative. And America has made a lot of mistakes. You see that, and you know, this is what gets highlighted in the media as well. The mistakes made by the United States. And you know, they meddle in other people's affairs. They want to shove down a democracy down the throat of other people who are not capable of absorbing democracy. And I think no society is capable of having democracy anyway. But America thinks that its way is the only way. In my view, it is the only way for me. That is why I live in the US. But for most other people who are tribally minded, who are superstitious, who are irrational, American way does not work. But America itself has just drifted off its rational, moral Christian foundations anyway. It has become increasingly woke with time. It has become increasingly socialist time with time, and increasingly it has less and less control over criminalities developing within the United States' borders. Look at BLM or look at the Palestinian protests happening in the United States. And we can talk separately whether I'm for or against Palestinians. But the fact remains that why should we be suffering from a war which is happening on the other side of the world and a war which is actually just noise in the affairs of the world? It's only relates to a couple of million people when the world's population is close to 8,000 million people. So, United States meddles in other people's affairs, but without the US, the world would be a lot more unstable. And in fact, this is my biggest fear. As the US weakens, and the US will continue to weaken because it's becoming woke, irrespective of who actually comes to power next year. But as the US weakens, Venezuela coups in sub-Saharan Africa, a rapid increase in instabilities around the third world countries will continue to increase, and criminality within the United States will increase. So we are actually looking forward to a very chaotic future over the next decade or so, irrespective of what comes out next year. But I do really hope one of those three or four gentlemen from the Republican Party win the election next year.
It's interesting you said that because I interviewed some other just large names and they had very similar concerns that you just shared. And things are becoming more unstable. And unfortunately, and this is a point of sadness and also fear that the US is losing influence. And that's just making things more unstable. Talk a little bit about last time we talked, I believe you were in Tokyo, if I can say that, and you had a lot of comments on Japan, and now you're traveling. I won't say exactly where you're at, but you're traveling through Asia. What is your experience and your time in Asia now, has that changed your perspective at all about investing in Asia?
So, geographically, Asia is a very broad term. You have all the way from Saudi Arabia to Palestine to India to Pakistan to Japan. These are completely separate universes. Uh, what I like within Asia is the East Asian part, and particularly Japan, South Korea, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. These are very stable countries because these people, over the last 150, 200 years, have adopted and adapted the Western values very nicely. They
The
have
values that we're
adopted,
neglecting now.
which is unfortunate because
Right.
as you go socialist, as you go woke, you give up on your Christian foundations, you give up on your Western philosophy, you give up on your Western values, and fruit of those have very nicely been adopted by these East Asian countries. Now, China might like to say that it's a very China-centric country. They have their own Confucian background, but remember, it was the Western influence that crystallized those values. So, Western Christian missionaries and Western colonizers, what they did always was to cherry pick good values they saw based on their background in the local scriptures of any country that they tried to influence. So the fact remains that these countries in East Asia have been heavily, heavily influenced by the Western society. And that is what makes them human. Humanity is different from animal kingdom only because of its moral and rational values. East Asians have done an excellent job of it. And that is why I think East Asia will be a very stable part of the world over the next few decades. Here is the problem, Andy, though, that the what the foundations of Western values and Christian moral fabric that was laid in the West, in Europe, and in North America, and in Australia and New Zealand, have not been laid in East Asia. They don't have the moral foundations. They have everything else was created over those foundations. These people have done an absolutely amazing job of building, construct by copying the fruit of Western values. The problem remains is a lot less emphasis on free thinking, freedom of speech, um, certain values that were a product of that is a part of Western values. So that is where East Asia misses out on. But I hope they eventually underpin their structure by a moral foundation as well, and not just based on utilitarian or expedient, what is expedient for them.
Well, it's interesting. It's making me think here. Let's, if you would, comment about or work out a little bit more about what's going on in Africa, as it seems like in our Western media. Comment specifically about that, or what you see going on, and how long, if that's going to really blow, or if it is blowing up, and how long do you see that lasting? And it seems like a very delicate and sad situation.
So, Andy, these tribal warfares will break out around the third world going forward because America is no longer there to stop these people from breaking out into wars. Uh,
Let me interrupt you
Amer-
real quick, because you mentioned that last time, and it was very interesting, that specific point.
it is the fear of America which keeps the tyrants of these third world countries into a limited, which constrains these tyrants. But unconstrained by the US, these tyrants go wild. And that is what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. But that's also happening in Latin America. That is also happening in South Asian countries. And the thing is that America was never capable of controlling the whole world. But because America created created peace, and it was able to go and influence any country that was no longer following Pax Americana. Everyone was afraid, and everyone was trying to toe the line of America. But America is now proving that it can't control its affairs in Ukraine. It has issues in Gaza, and it is unnecessarily embroiling itself in the Taiwanese affair. Now, again, I am all for a free Taiwan, but America is unnecessarily agitating China at this moment. So, because its focus is at wrong places, and also a lot of American bureaucracy has become extremely woke. I was just reading that the Boston mayor had only a non-white people Christmas party. Now, this is extreme segregation. This is extreme racism. Uh, this is the kind of society that the US is uh, uh, evolving into. It is not evolution, it is a society going feral because of the democratic pressures from irrational, immoral people. Because of this thing, there are coups now happening in Africa, and America is not there to control them. Now, rebels in Yemen are, creating a lot of problems in the Red Sea. They just hijacked a cargo ship, and America is, of course, going after these rebels, from what I know. But the problem is that increasingly these wild, uh, tyrannical forces are starting to think that America is not going to go after them, and that is leading to all these coups. Now, I have Andy, before I started going to sub-Saharan Africa, I read 3 or 4 books on Sudan about the civil war that's been happening in Sudan. And, this is truly something people should read a lot about what's happening in these third world countries, how tribal they are, how irrationally rooted these people are, and why there is actually no solution to their problems. So, on one hand, America probably should have let them fight with each other and kill each other, and that would have been a really stable situation for them. But now that America and the Western powers created Britannia, and Pax Americana, what happened is that the populations of, let's say, Africa is 10 times or 20 times as much as what it was before Europeans started having their influence in Africa. Basically, you can do simple math and imagine that about 90 to 95% of African population is prone to disappear over the next few decades as Pax America comes to an end. So that is how horrible end of Pax Americana will be for 90 to 95% of living people in the third world.
So you have all this chaos, and it really looks like coming revolution on the continent of Africa, as well as Central and South America, Latin America. And obviously that's going to have a negative impact on investing in these countries and also supply of commodities and supply chain. My question to you is, where would you, in these areas, is that still a place where you'd be looking to invest? Or are there specific pockets that you see as a lot safer in Africa or Latin America? Or there's some places that are just, it's going to be rife with war, civil war. And as an investor, it's too risky.
So there are two parts of that question, Andy. One is the supply of commodities. I'm not afraid about the supply of commodities. Commodities are called commodities because they are fungible. They find a way around all the chaos. So you had a war developing between Ukraine and Russia. The world thought that oil would start going into short supply. And oil prices did shoot up. But soon thereafter, oil prices normalized again and came much lower. Commodities have a way to find their way around the system. So the world's chaos is not going to create a problem with supply of commodities, except in case there's actually a war where the oil fields are. Um, Commodities will be perfectly fine. I am not so concerned about supplies of, let's say, cobalt or REEs, because again, China can make all the claims about stopping flow of some of these commodities into the world market, but you will find a way to uh, get those commodities in the world market. Um, at least from an investor's perspective. Now, do I want to invest in mines um, in certain countries? Well, I do. I want to invest. My clients and I are heavily invested in African countries. We are heavily invested in Latin American countries. But what we would pay $1 in, let's say, Canada, is what we would only pay 10 cents in a lot of other countries. So, because we are now expecting a much higher return for the political risks we take, we want to get a much better upside from these countries. That only means that it's the local people who suffer because they get money at a much higher cost of capital. But but when their intentions are expropriatory, they get punished from it by it, but then they don't realize it. They don't see the causality.
Well, that all being said, your outlook for 24 in commodities, what would you say are you most bullish on? Yeah. What are you most bullish on? And what are you not doing?
Okay, so I prefer not to speculate on commodities because again, commodities are so fungible, and they're called commodities because supply and demand takes care of itself. But there are two things I can talk about. One is that I am very optimistic about the price of gold in 2024. And the reason is that the world is going to become increasingly chaotic. Maybe if a good president comes in, we have a, a breathing space for a couple of years. But apart from that, we're going to become very chaotic over the next few years. And even if a Republican president comes, I think America is now recognizing that it has no business getting involved in the affairs of other countries. So I think gold price has a good future, at least in 2024. I think the one thing that the world is not paying proper attention to is, or actually thinks that is very contrary to what I think, is China. China is a far better country than the Western media portrays it to be. Uh, Chinese are focused on economic growth. China has a property crisis, but remember, if they had a real socialist woke government, what would it have done? The government would have come along and helped the property market not go bankrupt. So the same people who say that America should not be getting involved in 2008 when it got involved in the property market crisis, they say America should have let these property companies go bust, are exactly the people who say that China has a problem. Well, China is trying to let market solve its own problems by letting the property market correct itself. And that is creating avenues for poor people to buy housing that they could not afford earlier. Chinese property market, from what I saw a few months when I was in China, have fallen by as much as 50%, which has made those properties affordable to a lot more people. So, there will be a lot of crisis in China. China will have many social and political problems over the next few years. But I think there's still a lot of energy left in China. Thinking about China will change over the period of time. But this Taiwan affair manages to create a negative impression about China. I think people should look at these things separately. There is indeed a Taiwan affair, and I am pro-Taiwan on this issue. But at the same time, I'm extremely, extremely optimistic about China. And in fact, I also think there will not be a war between China and Taiwan. Taiwanese, Chinese, ethnic Chinese are very accommodating people. If they think that they will lead a war will lead to an economic destruction, they will accommodate they will accommodate themselves around it. So I don't think there will be a war with Taiwan.
I would agree with you. I think gold's going to do very well in 2024. But talk to me about your expertise is really in analyzing and evaluating the juniors. The juniors have been just kicked around, and it's been a while since we've had a good run in them. Talk about them as a whole. Where do you see the juniors going?
So let's talk about the junior sector. Junior mining sector has fallen about 80 to 85% in the last 2 decades. Uh, uh, Nominal terms. So in real terms, it has fallen even more. So there has been a massive destruction of wealth in the junior mining sector. And the problem is that the kind of greedy investors that junior mining sector attracts um, creates pathways for psychopaths to get money from these investors. So I think the prime responsibility of what is wrong with the junior mining sector goes to these investors. Now, I'm not going to name names here, but I invested in one company that has a project in Brazil. They bought another project, and they bought the third project, and they bought the fourth project, and they bought another project in Europe. All projects that um, uh, bankrupted a series of companies in the past. Now, this management somehow magically thinks that they can bring five projects that failed several companies in the past, will be able to make these projects work. Um, and they are not even miners; they are finance people. This is, but they are still relying on the fact that the mentality of what used to exist 20 years back is going to help them rise with the tide. But that isn't going to happen. I think a lot of these useless companies with useless projects will go extinct over the next 1 or 2 years, which actually will be very healthy for the economy, except that both Canadian and Australian governments are giving a lot of money to these scam artists under the garb of critical metals, battery metals, or whatever you call them. But most of the money that Canadian and Australian governments are giving will end up in the pockets of scam artists. And names of some companies, there's a company called O3 Mining. I just gave them more of my money. They are trading at about $1.55 Canadian. I think it has a good place at the current price. There's a company called Irving Mining, Irving Resources. The ticker is IRV. It's trading at 49 cents. It has a project in Japan, and that is what has kept me going to Japan. My clients and I are big investors in that company. Now, this can indeed go to zero because they have nothing as yet, but they are drilling areas which are extremely prospective, and things can change overnight for this company. So this is a probability game. Uh, there's a company called Montage Gold. It has a gold project in West Africa. It is trading around 65, 70 cents. I'm very optimistic about them, very competent management. And again, despite West Africa, if you can manage the political affairs, if you can, if you can navigate the social, tribal, and political conflicts, you can actually make a lot of money, because then you have not only the value there, but also a value at a very underpriced market valuation. So these are some of the companies that I could think of right now.
Got it. About that, what is your process, if you would, in evaluating a country company? So, are you looking at jurisdiction? Are you looking at management team? Are you looking at what kind of money they have in the bank or drill results? What exactly? Yeah, what's your methodology, and what exactly how do you rank them before you start writing them a check?
Well, certainly I want to look at the management. The management has to be business wise, they have to be ethical, and they have to be street smart, because they have to deal with all these ESG stupidities. They have to deal with the local corrupt politicians. So I want, but I still want them to be ethical. I want them to be doing the right thing for the local community and for wherever they are. I want them to be good citizens. The only reason I don't like this ESG is because it's all about packaging rather than about substance. But so I want good management. I also want to see. I don't care so much about jurisdictions. The only time I care about jurisdictions is when it is comes to, let's say, Congo or some of the really bad jurisdictions, which will steal everything that you have. So it makes no sense because whatever value there is must ultimately get multiplied by zero because governments will expropriate everything. So I don't care about certain countries, but mostly I'm interested in the management. And then I go through the valuation. I look at the projects and I want to understand whether the 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 value that the project has is, if that is higher than what I'm going to pay for it, I'm more than happy to invest in it. I don't wait for it to bottom out, kind of thing. I just invest based on value. And that is pretty much the process. So I do a lot of financial accounting. I do a lot of, I go through the balance sheets. I don't go to the profit and loss accounts. I go into the history of those, and I want to understand whether this management has created value over a period of time. What I do, Andy, always is to sit down with any management for a long enough time that I start getting a feel for their personalities. And that's extremely important for me.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was talking to Rick Rule maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, and I asked him the same question. And he said, the jurisdiction that I want to make sure I say this correct, but and as I'll paraphrase, but the jurisdiction that he's most concerned about in, I want to say he said he wouldn't invest in is California. So yeah, it just made you think, is it
Well,
going to happen?
yeah, but remember, you can't even invest in California. So, California is upfront about it. It just simply does not let you invest in California. It is not there to expropriate your money. Now, I live in California. I have no respect for the current regime in California. They simply won't let me invest in mining in California. So that's where the difference between California and Panama is, for example, where Panama simply asked a multi-billion-dollar project to be shut down overnight. This is height of stupidity. This is what expropriation is. This is the kind of countries I would not want to go into. But I am very optimistic. I like investing in countries where there is the rule of law. And if there's no rule of law, then I want to be, I want to make sure uh, my risk is accounted for in when I invest in those countries. California is something I just simply won't invest because they won't let me invest.
Hey, so thank you. Thank you for your thoughts, Giant. It was very enlightening as it was the last time. Any final thoughts you'd want to give to our viewers and listeners going into 2024?
Well, I think what one thing that I think is going to continue is that globalization is going to become worse and worse with time because we are distrustful of each other now going forward, and particularly distrustful of China. Now, uh, I have no fixed ideas whether we should be trusting China or not, despite the fact that I love China. But the cost of doing anything will continue to increase, and economies will continue to stagnate in many countries, which means that I see stagflation happening in a lot of parts of the world where people's quality of life will deteriorate over the next few years. So, unfortunately, that's what I see in the future. And I want to protect myself by investing in countries and keeping my money in countries which I think are politically safe and be around people I like.
Well, thank you so much, Giant. Again, it's very, very enlightening, and I much enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, happy Merry Christmas to you and Happy New Year.
Thank you very much, Andy, and Merry Christmas again, and Happy New Year to you too.